Hey creatives, I'm your host, Aylin Wild, and this is my podcast, Empathy Machine. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time, welcome. In this podcast, I discuss films, give you videography tips and tricks, and unpack other creative topics. In today's episode, I'll be discussing frame rates, what they are, where they come from, and how you can use them to enhance your videos. Now, this episode may get a little technical, and believe me, my head did feel a little bit like exploding when I was researching this, but believe it or not, this is actually quite a simple concept. I'm one of those people who likes to have context and to understand something from a deeper perspective. So the information I'm about to share with you may seem unnecessary, but I find it fascinating. So if anything else, I hope you learned something you didn't know before, which is always fun. Another thing I want to note is that all of the articles and resources I use to collect this episode will be listed in the show notes at aylinwildmedia.com/podcasts. So if there's anything else you don't quite understand or want to know more about, there's some really fantastic resources out there. So definitely go check those out. I had a lot of fun preparing for today's episode because I learned a lot of things I didn't know, which is a huge blessing. So anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the episode. Okay, so before I get into the modern camera technology and what frame rate means for us today and how you can use it, I'm going to take you back in time just a little bit to 1912 in Frankfurt, Germany, to meet a psychologist named Max Wertheimer, who published his habilitation thesis in 1912 on what is known as the phi phenomenon. The phi phenomenon is essentially a visual illusion in which the viewer perceives that a stationary object is actually moving. So think for a minute about a flip book. Obviously the images aren't moving, but when you flip through the pages, suddenly it comes to life. Why is that? Well, that's basically what Wertheimer wanted to find out. Why do still images appear to be moving when you see them quickly one after the other? So being a psychologist, he designed some experiments. He would show participants two lines that would flash rapidly one after the other and then ask them what they saw. He found that if these lines were flashing too slow, the participants would see two lines flashing separately, and if they were too fast, they appeared to be flashing at the same time. However, when it got to about 30 to 200 milliseconds in between flashes, they reported seeing one line move from one side to the other. This was also found in earlier experiments using flashing light, in which the viewer's eye would follow, in inverted commas, the light as their brains perceived the movement. This is due to what's called persistence of vision, which is basically the idea that the human eye will continue to perceive something for a short period of time after it has disappeared in reality. So if the images are disappearing and reappearing fast enough, our brain will assume that it must have moved from one position to another in a fluid motion because it didn't actually see it disappear. According to your brain, it was there and now it's over there. So it either teleported itself or it physically moved. Again, think of a flip book. Even though you know the images are not moving, you still see movement because that's how your brain works. It takes shortcuts. And that's essentially what makes film work. Film is essentially an illusion. You aren't watching a continuous moving image like you might think. You're watching many individual still images one after another. So, the million-dollar question, what is frame rate? Frame rate, or frames per second, as it's also known, is the number of still images your camera takes every second, or the number of frames that are exposed to light every second. So the human eye can perceive 10 to 12 frames a second as separate individual images, but anything more than that, and our brain decides it must be moving. Now, this is not the same thing as shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter stays open during each frame, or in other words, the length of time that each frame is exposed to light for. Taking us right back to the very early days of film, films were shown using a projector, which would shine a light through the film reel to be projected onto the screen. Now, obviously, as we talked about, film is an illusion of still images which appear to be moving, which means the film reel was made up of thousands of still images, one after another. Now, obviously, if you just ran the film through the projector in a continuous movement, it would look ridiculous because you'd see all this blur as you move the reel from one image to the next. So what they did was they shone the light through the film, then the shutter blade would spin in front of the light and essentially block it while the next frame was loaded up. And if you watch a really old film at 12 frames per second, you can actually see this. I mean, it's basically flickering and it's really distracting to watch. So to eliminate this flicker, Thomas Edison discovered that it would disappear at 46 frames per second, which is essentially when our persistence of vision kicks in. So we can no longer see the black frames in between because our brain isn't fast enough to pick it up, so it thinks it's not there. Now, film was expensive, and showing a whole 46 frames per second to eliminate flicker was just too expensive for most filmmakers. Remember, it was actual physical film. So they came up with the double and triple bladed shutter, which would basically repeat the frame 2 times for a double bladed shutter and 3 times for a triple bladed shutter before moving on to the next frame. So 16 frames per second on a triple bladed shutter would show as 48 frames per second and eliminate the flicker effect. You have to remember though that silent films and films, made at the very beginning of film were all hand cranked. So the frame rates were understandably all over the place. They would range anywhere from 14 frames per second to 26 frames per second. There was no standard, so they all looked wildly different. To speed the images up, the camera operator would overcrank and essentially film in a higher frame rate, and to slow it down, they would undercrank and film in a lower frame rate. So everything was done manually by hand. And this wasn't really a big deal until sound came into the mix. The reason it was a big deal is because if you record your footage at a different speed to how you record your audio, your dialogue is not going to match the person speaking. And obviously, if you speed up or slow down audio, the pitch changes. So there became this need to standardize frame rates based on the audio recording software available. One of these devices was called the Vitaphone, which would record and synthesize sound with the film projection using electric motors which were powered by the same source, so they would never be out of sync with the video. Or the film, not the video, the film. And the Vitaphone used a 16-inch disc format, which would play at 33 1/3 rounds per minute, which would record for a total of 11 minutes, capturing 1,000 feet of film at 90 feet a minute, which comes out to 24 frames per second. The Movietone, which was another similar device, also recorded at 24 frames per second, and as these were the 2 most commonly used, in 1929, 24 frames per second became the official industry standard for film, and it continues to be to this day. It was also the lowest frame rate that was easily divisible for editors and made it easier for them to cut. Now, not every film is filmed at this frame rate, such as famously Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, which received wide criticism for being shot at 48 frames per second because it apparently looked too much like a cheap TV drama, which leads me nicely to television. So with the invention of television came a new problem with the old system of consecutive flashing images. To conserve bandwidth and avoid flickering, TV used an interlocking technique in which the screen was essentially broken down into 2 sets of lines or fields. So there were upper fields and lower fields. So rather than showing the same frame 2 or 3 times, TV would show the upper field and the lower field of the image. However, this would produce distortion due to electrical currents. So to eliminate this, just like we talked about before with the optimal frame rate of 48 frames per second to eliminate the flicker, the refresh rate of these interweaving fields was matched to that of the AC power, which in the US is 60 Hertz or 60 fields per second. Now remember, each field is only half an image, so either made up of top or bottom fields. So 60 fields per second is a full 30 frames per second. So for television, frame rates were standardized at 30 frames per second. Now, this was great for black and white television, but as technology advanced and color TV was being developed in 1948, they suddenly had a new dilemma. They had to find a way to make the old black and white, or VHF system, compatible with the new color, or UHF system, of higher frequency bandwidth. Otherwise, everyone would essentially have to throw away their old TVs, which would no longer work. So they came up with this system in which the image would be broken down into luminance, which is the black and white spectrum, and chrominance, or the color spectrum. Broadcasters could then embed a color signal as a subcarrier, which could essentially be left out by the older black and white TV sets. However, the problem was the bandwidth used by this subcarrier had the potential to interfere with the audio signal, so they decided to reduce the frame rate by 0.1% so that the color and audio signals would never actually match or intercept each other. So in 1953, the color broadcast system went from 60 fields per second down to 59.94, which equates to 29.97 frames per second, which is why when you import your footage into Premiere, It won't say 24, 30, or 60 frames per second, but it will show you 23.976, 29.97, or 59.94 frames per second. So this system of 29.97 frames per second is only used in NTSC broadcasting countries such as Northern America. The European system uses PAL, or phase altering line, which was introduced in 1967. It was designed to solve some of the color problems of the NTSC system by reversing the signal on alternate lines. Now in Europe, they have a different power system to America, so theirs is 50 hertz instead of 60, which means their TV is 50 fields per second and therefore 25 frames per second. So just to recap, the standard American TV is shown at roughly 30 frames per second. The standard European TV is shown at 25 frames per second, and films are usually shown at 24 frames per second. And if you take a film and play it on a television, it will be slowed down by 0.1%, making it 23.976 frames per second. So if you've ever wondered what all those weird numbers are about, that's why. Okay, is your head exploding yet? It's a lot of information, I know, don't worry, I'm getting to the good stuff now. So how is all of this relevant to today? Well, now that you understand what frame rate is and why there are different types, let's have a look at how you can use it in a practical sense. So a quick recap. Frame rate, or frames per second, is the number of still images your camera takes every second, or the number of frames that are exposed to light every second. Shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter stays open during each frame, or in other words, the length of time that each frame is exposed to light for. The general rule of thumb is to set your shutter speed at double your frame rate. Now remember the old rotary shutters we talked about that would advance a frame with each rotation? Doubling your shutter speed gives you a 180-degree shutter, which means the shutter will stay open for the entire frame. If you record at 60 frames per second, for example, and you set the shutter speed at 1/30, which is 1/30th of a second, you're essentially only getting half the information because the shutter is only open half the time. So you end up with 30 individual images being duplicated, essentially. So always keep your shutter speed faster than your frame rate, which will ensure the shutter is kept open the whole time. It doesn't necessarily have to be double. For example, you could have your shutter speed set to 1/100 and your frame rate set to 60 frames per second. As long as your shutter speed is always a larger number, your image won't be negatively affected. So, what frame rate should you be shooting in? If more frames means more information, shouldn't you always shoot in the highest frame rate? Well, you could. A lot of video games are set to 60 frames per second, which gives a really crisp and clear image. But generally speaking, this can look a little too crisp. You don't want people watching your video and feeling like they're watching some super polished, surrealist computer game, unless that is what you want, in which case, by all means do that. But in general, the standard for film remains 24 frames per second. Another reason you should always shoot in 24 frames per second is because most cameras are optimized to shoot at this frame rate. For example, my camera, the Canon 70D DSLR camera, will only shoot at 24, 25, or 50 frames per second. But at 50 frames per second, it will only shoot in 720p quality rather than 1080p as it will at 24 frames per second. This is definitely something to keep in mind, as generally speaking, most cameras will lower the quality at higher frame rates. Specifically, any kind of footage that you want to show at normal speed, so 100% speed, you would shoot at 24 frames per second. So this is generally stuff like interviews, landscapes, anything that doesn't really move much and you need it to be in real time. So obviously, as we talked about before, anytime you change the speed of a piece of audio, it changes the pitch. So if you need audio in your footage, you would definitely record at 24 frames per second and keep it at 100% speed. Otherwise, your audio is going to sound really wacky when you slow it down. If you are planning on speeding up your footage and you want lots of motion blur, so say you were filming a hyperlapse or you were zooming through a crowd of people, you would lower your frame rate to say 16 frames per second. Just remember though, once you've lowered it to this level, you won't be able to use it at a normal speed without it looking blurry and horrible. So you only want to record at a low frame rate like this for artistic reasons when you know you're only going to be using it to achieve that particular effect. If you wanted to slow your footage down just a bit to say 80%, you would record at 30 frames per second. So maybe your subject isn't talking, but they're walking or they're moving in some way and you don't want them to look blurry when you slow it down. If you wanted to slow your footage down to slow motion, say 40% speed, you would record at 60 frames per second. This is great for B-roll, so people laughing, clapping, dancing, or someone speaking or singing over the top of interview footage. That way your brain doesn't get confused when you see someone talking and it's not matched up with the speech because clearly it's in slow motion. Sometimes in music videos as well, they will record at 60 frames per second and speed up the song to double time. So when they play it back at 24 frames per second, the singer is lip syncing in time to the song, but they're clearly in slow motion. If you really want to slow it down to, say, 20% speed, you would shoot at 120 frames per second, which gives a beautiful, clear image if that's the effect you're going for. You might want to think about using this if your shot is really, really shaky as well, because whenever you slow footage down, the camera shake is a lot less noticeable. Just be aware, though, that most cameras will crop your image when shooting at a really high frame rate like this, and again, you may have a loss in quality. Something I see a lot of people do, especially wedding videographers, is use slow motion a lot, like in every single shot. And yes, it does. It looks beautiful and cinematic, but it can start to look really generic and dull. So try using speed ramping, different effects. So, maybe you're at 100% speed and then suddenly you slow it right down, or, you speed it right up. Just try to keep it a bit unexpected, and that way you'll keep your viewer engaged and interested. Now, if you are shooting at different frame rates for the same project, you really have to pay attention to what you're doing, because this is where it can get a bit tricky if you haven't really done it before. So say you record at 24 frames per second and you have a few shots in 30 and 60 frames per second. Do not make your project 30 or 60 frames per second. Even if you only have one shot at 24 frames per second, always set your project to the lowest frame rate you're planning on using. If you were to set it at 30 frames per second and use a clip you shot in 24 frames per second, your editing software would have to magic up 6 frames from nowhere, which is going to look really weird. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have to make sure when you're mixing frame rates that everything divides evenly. So, for example, if you had your timeline set to 24 frames per second and you put in a clip that was shot in 25 frames per second, your editing software will essentially delete 1 frame for every second, and that's going to produce a jumpy effect. Similarly, if you put in a clip recorded at 50 frames per second, again, if you slow this down to 50% speed, which is 25 frames per second, you're still missing a frame every second. On the other hand, if you had clips at 30 and 60 frames per second, these both divide evenly into 24. So for the 30 frames per second clips, you would slow it down to 80%, because 24 divided by 30 is 0.8, which is 80%. And for the 60 frame per second clip, you would slow it down to 40%. So 60 divided by 24 is 0.4, which is 40%. If you had some clips recorded at 120 frames per second, you would slow them down to 20%. So why are we slowing it down? Okay, the reason for slowing them down is that if you don't and your project is set to 24 frames per second, they're going to look a little bit sharp and jittery because there's so many frames in there and there's a whole bunch of extra frames for your 24 frames per second project. But when you slow them down, they're going to be nice and smooth. Now, if you're using Premiere Pro, rather than going through individually to each clip and slowing it down, you can actually set all of your clips to be at the same frame rate, which will essentially slow them down to the correct speeds for you. So select the clips in your project panel, not in your timeline, and right click, and then go down to modify and then interpret footage. This will bring up the modify clip dialog box, and under the frame rate section, it will automatically have selected use frame rate from file. Instead, select assume this frame rate and enter 23.976 or whatever your timeline is. Premiere will now assume all clips are 23.976 frames per second and will effectively slow down your clips for you, without you having to do the math or individually slow them down. Another thing to keep in mind as well, like I said earlier, is that some cameras won't allow you to record at the highest quality, so 1080p or 4K for higher frame rates, so you may have to adjust the sizes in post-production as well. In Premiere, you can set it to automatically scale your clips to your sequence settings, so go to Edit and then Preferences and then Media, Default Media Scaling, and then select Set to Frame Size. So now all of your clips will be scaled either up or down to whatever your sequence settings are. If you're not planning on using multiple frame rates and you're just using, say, 60 frames per second, you won't need to slow it down, unless you want to, of course. So maybe you've got a GoPro with some action shots and you want people to see what's happening clearly, but you don't want to slow it down. That's great. Just keep it at 100% speed. But as soon as you have any lower frame rates in there, that's when it becomes a problem. So that's when you're going to have to slow it down. So again, for a 24 frames per second project timeline, which remember is the cinematic standard, for hyperlapses and motion blur shots, you would shoot at 16 frames per second and speed it up to 150% speed. For interviews, landscapes, and anything where the subject isn't moving too much, you would shoot at 24 frames per second and keep it at 100% speed. For movement shots and anything that you want to be a little bit more clear and slightly slow motion, you would set it to 30 frames per second and set it to 80% speed. For classic slow motion, laughing, clapping, dancing type scenes, you would record at 60 frames per second and slow it down to 40% speed. And for super slow motion, dramatic, cinematic shots, you would film at 120 frames per second and slow it down to 20% speed. And remember as well, keep an eye on your shutter speed and make sure it's always higher than your frame rate. So usually you would aim for double. You have to be intentional about this, especially if you're mixing different frame rates in the same project. You don't want to film B-roll at 50 frames per second for some slow motion shots when you film the interview at 24 frames per second rather than 25, because 50 does not divide evenly into 24. So in this case, you would either shoot the interview at 25 frames per second and the B-roll at 50 and then slow it down to 50% speed, or you would shoot the interview at 24 frames per second and the B-roll at 60 and slow it down to 40% speed. So do you see what I mean about intentionality? Don't give yourself the headache of having to scrap a whole bunch of footage in post. If you're not really sure, film at 24 frames per second. You can't mess this up. Once you get more confident, you can change it up and add in some 30 and 60 frame per second footage for some slow motion shots. But make sure, again, there's no dialogue in there because you won't be able to slow this down. Have I fried your brain? Or was this interesting? If you're super confused by all of this, don't panic. There are so many great free resources out there, and once you get this, it's really not very complicated. I believe in you. All right, guys, that's it for today's episode on frame rates. Thank you so much for listening, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If this episode inspired you at all, please don't forget to leave me a review. That would be really helpful, and I'd love to hear your feedback and any requests you might have for future episodes. Also, check out the show notes for this episode at aylinwildmedia.com/podcast. I will be putting all the resources I used in the show notes for this week. I hope you have a great week and tune in next time for more creative insight into my experiences in the world of video and film.